A racist police officer sees a black man in a white neighborhood and assumes that the black man is a criminal and arrests him. Later, the officer is informed that he has just arrested an on-duty CIA agent. David Smith sat in his unmarked car, engine off, windows slightly cracked to let in the warm summer air. The quiet suburban street stretched before him, rows of identical houses with perfectly trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and not a soul in sight. He'd been there for hours, watching the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. The target hadn't left since morning. "Stay focused, David," he murmured under his breath. He flexed his hands on the wheel, his senses on high alert. The suspect wouldn't stay hidden forever. He had to move soon, or David would know something had gone wrong inside. The sun sank lower, bathing the neighborhood in golden light. David stayed still, ready for anything, knowing that at any moment, everything could change. Officer Ray Carter drove slowly through the neighborhood, his patrol car's engine humming softly in the stillness of the suburban streets. It was a quiet day as usual. This part of town rarely saw any trouble, just the kind of place Carter liked to keep that way. Neat lawns, clean sidewalks, and the kind of people who waved at cops when they passed by. As he turned the corner, something caught his eye. A car, unmarked, sitting at the far end of the street, parked just a little too far from the curb. Carter narrowed his eyes. It wasn't the kind of car you usually saw around here. Too plain, too out of place. He drove past it slowly, craning his neck to get a look at the driver. Black guy, alone, just sitting there. Carter's grip tightened on the wheel. It didn't take much for his mind to start spinning. Guy like that didn't have any business being here, not unless he was up to something. He rolled past the car, keeping an eye on it in his rearview mirror. No movement. "Now what's this about?" Carter muttered under his breath. He pulled his cruiser over to the curb a few houses down, leaving enough space between him and the car to not make it obvious. He radioed into dispatch, keeping it casual. "Unit 2-4, gonna check out a suspicious vehicle near Maple Drive. Black male in the driver's seat. No visible plates. I'll investigate further." The dispatcher acknowledged the call, but Carter had already stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his belt and making sure his badge was visible. His mind raced as he walked toward the car, trying to decide how to handle this. Maybe the guy was lost, but Carter doubted it. He'd seen this too many times before. Black guy, nice neighborhood, usually didn't end well. He approached slowly, scanning the area as he walked. The street was quiet, too quiet. No one was around to see what was happening, and Carter liked that. He was in control, and whatever happened next would be on his terms. As he neared the driver's side window, he glanced in, his posture stiff. The man inside, still sitting calmly, glanced up and met his gaze, but he didn't move. Carter knocked on the window, his knuckles tapping sharply on the glass. The man didn't seem surprised. That rubbed Carter the wrong way. "Afternoon," Carter said, trying to keep his voice steady, but the edge in it was clear. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" The man, who looked to be in his late 30s, coolly rolled down the window. His face was calm, his expression controlled. Carter didn't like that either. "I'm working," the man said, his voice even. "I'm with the government, just on duty." He kept his hands on the wheel, not making any sudden movements, which told Carter that he was used to encounters like this. Too used to it, maybe. Carter frowned. "Government, huh? You got ID to back that up?" "Yeah, I do," the man replied. "In the glove compartment. I can reach for it if you want." Carter didn't move, didn't even blink. His suspicion only deepened. The guy was too calm, too collected. Guys like this weren't supposed to be here, and they sure as hell didn't have government jobs, at least not ones that kept them sitting in cars on quiet streets like this. Carter had seen enough. He stepped closer to the car, hand resting on his belt, near his holster. "How about you tell me exactly what kind of government work you're doing here, and don't make any sudden moves." The man glanced briefly at Carter's hand, then back up at his face. "I'm on a federal surveillance operation. Can't go into details, but I'm supposed to be here." Carter's eyes narrowed. "Surveillance, huh? That's funny, because last I checked, we handle things like that around here. Never heard of any federal op going down in my neighborhood." The man's expression didn't change. "You wouldn't hear about it. It's classified." That did it. The tone, the calm, almost patronizing way the man spoke to him, like Carter didn't know what was going on in his own neighborhood. Like this guy was above him, untouchable. Carter's jaw tightened. "You mind stepping out of the car?" Carter asked, though it was less of a question and more of a command. His voice dropped lower, more forceful. The man's eyes stayed steady, his hands still on the wheel. "Look, I'm just doing my job here. My ID's in the glove compartment. Just take a look, and this will all be cleared up." Carter shook his head, taking another step closer. He could feel the tension rising between them. "I'll tell you what's going to happen. You're going to step out of the car, nice and slow, and then we'll sort this out. For a moment, the man didn't move. He just stared at Carter, as if sizing him up, deciding whether to comply or keep arguing. Finally, the man exhaled, his frustration barely showing. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll step out." Carter watched closely as the man unlocked the door and opened it, his movements slow and deliberate. He was complying, but there was something about his calmness that still irritated Carter. Like this guy thought he was in control. Carter wasn't about to let that happen. As the man got out of the car, Carter's hand hovered even closer to his holster. He didn't trust this situation. Not one bit. The man stood up straight, his hands still visible. But there was something in his stance, in the way he moved, that didn't sit right with Carter. The man didn't look like a criminal, but then again, Carter had learned not to trust appearances, especially when a black guy was sitting in a car that didn't belong in a neighborhood like this. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not here, not now. "Hands where I can see them," Carter ordered, his voice growing harder, more commanding. The man complied, but his eyes never left Carter's. Calm, controlled, almost as if he'd been through this exact scenario before, and that only made Carter angrier. The man was in his custody now, and whatever his story was, Carter was going to find out soon enough. David stood beside his car, hands raised slightly, watching Officer Ray Carter with a calm expression. He'd been through encounters like this before, far too often. The same routine, the same tension. He knew the signs, how an officer's body language shifted when suspicion took over. He could see it in Carter's eyes, in the way his hand hovered near his waist. This wasn't going to go smoothly. Carter took a step forward, narrowing the distance between them. "Now let's try this again," he said, his tone sharp, almost condescending. "What are you really doing here?" David kept his voice steady. "I'm on a federal surveillance operation. I've already told you, officer. I have identification in the glove compartment that will clear all this up." "Federal surveillance?" Carter repeated, his skepticism thick. "That's convenient. And you just happen to be sitting in this nice neighborhood, no plates on your car, keeping an eye on things." "Right." David could feel the heat in Carter's words, but he didn't react. Keeping calm was the only way to get through this. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. Just check my ID and you'll see I'm on official duty." Carter shook his head slowly, like he'd heard this all before. "Yeah, I bet you've got a real convincing story. People like you always do. But that doesn't explain why you're just sitting here in this neighborhood looking all suspicious." David's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. "People like me? You know what I mean." Carter's eyes flicked over David, sizing him up. "You don't belong here, and I've got a job to do. So unless you want this to get worse, I suggest you stop talking and start cooperating." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and familiar. David had heard it before, in different forms from different people. "You don't belong here." It was always the same. "Officer, I'm trying to cooperate," David said, keeping his hands in sight. "I'm not a threat to you, and I'm not breaking any laws. Let's not escalate this." Carter smirked, his eyes glinting with a mix of arrogance and something darker. "Escalate? You think I'm escalating this? I'm just doing my job, making sure this neighborhood stays safe from people who don't belong. Now, are you going to let me search the car? Or do I need to put you in cuffs?" David's patience was thinning. He could feel the tension building, but he had to keep his composure. He couldn't let this turn into something more. "There's no need for that. My ID is right there. Take a look, and you'll see I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Carter's smirk faded, replaced by a harder edge. "You think I'm just gonna take your word for it? Like you're some kind of special case? I don't care what you're doing here. What I see is a guy sitting in a car with no plates, in a neighborhood where he doesn't belong, trying to act like he's got something to hide." David shook his head slightly, frustration creeping in despite his best efforts. "I'm not hiding anything." "Then you won't mind if I take a look around," Carter said, stepping closer to the car. David's voice dropped, firm but controlled. "I'm telling you, I'm on a federal operation. If you interfere with this, you could jeopardize something bigger than either of us." Carter chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Federal operation? Really? You expect me to believe that? Guys like you?" He stopped himself, then shrugged. "Let me put it this way. I don't care what story you're spinning. Right now, you're a guy who's acting suspicious, and that's all I need to know." David watched him carefully. "Officer, I don't want any trouble, but you're making a mistake." Carter's eyes hardened. "The only mistake I see here is you thinking you can pull one over on me. Now step back from the car." David didn't move. He kept his gaze steady, watching the officer carefully, measuring his next move. He knew where this was heading. He'd been here before, in situations where calm reasoning didn't matter, situations where the color of his skin spoke louder than anything he could say. Last chance, Carter said, his hand dropping closer to his holster. Step back. David inhaled slowly, letting the frustration settle deep inside him, controlled but present. This doesn't have to go like this. Oh, but it does, Carter said, his voice dripping with finality. You see, I know exactly what's going on here. You think because you throw some fancy words around, I'm gonna back off. But here's the thing, I'm in charge now, not you. David stared at him, realizing there was nothing left to say. This wasn't about protocol anymore. It wasn't about reason or facts. It was about power, about control, and Carter wasn't going to give it up. I'm just asking you to look at my ID, David said quietly. And I'm asking you to get back, Carter snapped. His hand hovered over his holster now, his posture rigid. Now. David took a step back, his hand still visible. He knew that at this point, compliance was his only option. The situation was too far gone. Carter wasn't listening, wasn't going to listen. But as he stepped back, David felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. The routine, the assumptions, the feeling of being reduced to something less than he was, no matter what he said or did. It was a burden he'd carried for years, but it never got easier. Carter stepped toward the car, his eyes darting over the interior. I'm going to take a look around, and you're going to stand right there. Got it? David didn't respond. He just stood there watching as Carter leaned in to search the car, his movements methodical, almost eager. It didn't matter that he'd explained himself. It didn't matter that his ID was within arm's reach. All that mattered now was that Carter had already made up his mind. The officer straightened up after a moment, turning back to David with a self-satisfied look. Nothing suspicious, huh? Well, you've still got some explaining to do. David's patience was gone, but his control wasn't. He looked Carter in the eye, his voice low. You're wrong, and this is going to catch up with you. Carter snorted. Sure it will. But for now, I'm the one giving the orders. David stared at him, silent but resolute. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. David clenched his jaw, his muscles tensing. He wanted to keep calm, keep his head down, but the officer's arrogance was becoming unbearable. Officer, David said, his voice steady but firm, you're making a mistake. I've been nothing but cooperative. I've told you who I am, why I'm here, and where my credentials are. All you have to do is look. Cooperative? Carter shot back, his voice growing more aggressive. You think this is cooperative? Sitting in a car in a neighborhood where you don't belong, making me go through all this trouble? He shook his head. People like you always have a story. I've heard them all. There it was again. People like you. David felt a familiar burn in his chest, a mix of frustration and anger that he had learned to suppress over the years. It wasn't just about this moment. It was about all the moments like this one. The stops, the suspicion, the assumptions. It was always the same. You're wrong, David said quietly, his voice tight. And when you realize that, it's going to be too late. Carter's face twisted into a sneer. Is that a threat? Are you threatening me? David met his gaze, not backing down. No, it's not a threat. It's the truth. For a second, the two men stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. David kept his posture calm, but he could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. Carter, on the other hand, was bristling, his arrogance now morphing into full-blown aggression. He couldn't let it go. Turn around, Carter said, his voice dropping an octave. His hand moved to his holster, resting on it now, not just hovering. I said turn around. David's heart rate quickened, but he didn't move. Officer, don't do this. I'm not resisting, but this is going too far. Look at my ID. I'm done with your ID, Carter snapped, his hand now gripping his tool of authority. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Now. David hesitated for a moment, knowing how dangerous things had become. He could push back, could demand that Carter follow protocol, but at this point, he knew it would only escalate further. The wrong move, the wrong word, and this could go from bad to worse in an instant. Slowly, he turned around, keeping his hands visible. He knew this wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about power. Carter wanted to show he was in control, and David had no choice but to comply. His pulse pounded in his ears as he placed his hands behind his back, feeling the humiliation settling in. Carter moved quickly, roughly grabbing David's wrists and snapping the cold metal cuffs around them. David winced as the cuffs dug into his skin, but he stayed quiet. The sharp click of the handcuffs felt like the final note in this drawn-out symphony of injustice. You see how easy that was? Carter said, his voice thick with self-satisfaction. All you had to do was cooperate from the start, and this wouldn't have gone so far. David stood still, refusing to respond. He could feel Carter's breath on the back of his neck as the officer patted him down, searching for something, anything, that could justify what he had just done. Of course, there was nothing. Once satisfied with his search, Carter yanked David toward the patrol car, shoving him roughly against the door before opening it. David braced himself, his body tensing as Carter pushed him inside. The hard plastic seat was cold against his back. The interior of the patrol car was stifling, the air thick and heavy. David could hear Carter talking to himself as he walked back toward the front, but the words didn't matter. The only sound that echoed in David's mind was the click of those handcuffs, the finality of it. Through the window, David watched as Carter radioed something in, probably gloating to his dispatcher about the suspect he had just arrested. David leaned his head back against the seat, staring up at the roof of the car. His mind was racing, not with fear, but with a kind of deep, tired anger. He'd done everything right. He'd complied, kept his voice calm, tried to explain, and still here he was, handcuffed in the back of a police car, treated like a criminal for no reason other than Carter's own prejudice. Carter got back in the car, turning the ignition and glancing at David in the rearview mirror. He didn't say anything, just smiled that same smug smile he'd worn since the start. He had won, in his mind. He had put David in his place. As they pulled away from the curb, David stared out the window at the peaceful, tree-lined streets of the neighborhood, the same streets where people like him didn't belong. He could feel the weight of Carter's arrogance pressing down on him, but there was no fear, just a cold, simmering anger. Carter might have had his moment of power, but David knew the truth. He knew that this wouldn't end the way the officer thought it would. Sooner or later, Carter would realize the gravity of his mistake. As they drove off, David remained silent, his mind already planning the next steps. He would stay calm, stay in control. This wasn't over yet. David sat in the back of the patrol car, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. His eyes remained fixed on the world passing by outside the window. Quiet streets, pristine houses, perfectly manicured lawns. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him. These people had no idea what had just happened in their peaceful little corner of the world. To them, this was just another day. But for David, it was yet another reminder of how things could turn on a dime. Despite his experience, his training, and the years he had spent protecting people like the ones in these homes, here he was, treated like a criminal because he didn't belong. Carter drove in silence for a while, his satisfaction palpable in the confined space of the car. Every so often, David could see him glance into the rearview mirror, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Carter thought he had won. He thought he had done his job. But David knew better. The arrogance of the man was almost overwhelming. But David wasn't rattled. He had been through worse than this, much worse. The patrol car slowed to a stop at a red light, and Carter reached for the radio, picking it up with a casual flick of his wrist. "Dispatch, this is Unit 2-4, he said, his voice calm and cocky. "I'm bringing in a suspect, black male, no ID, suspicious behavior in a restricted area." David clenched his jaw. Even now, after all of this, Carter was twisting the truth, making it sound like he had been justified in his actions. But David kept quiet. He knew the truth would come out soon enough. The radio crackled with static, and the dispatcher's voice came through. "Copy that, Unit 2-4. Send through the suspect's details for processing." Carter paused, glancing at David again in the rearview mirror. He spoke with an air of finality, like he had just closed the book on this case. "Name?" David remained silent, staring out the window. He wasn't about to volunteer any more information. It wasn't his job to make this easy. Carter sighed, flipping open the small notepad he had pulled from his pocket earlier. "David Smith," he said, reading it off with the same dismissive tone he had used since the beginning. "No ID, says he's on some kind of federal surveillance, but I don't buy it." There was a long pause on the other end of the radio, longer than usual. Carter furrowed his brow, tapping the steering wheel impatiently. "Dispatch? You still there?" Static crackled for a moment before the dispatcher's voice came back, this time with a more serious tone. "Hold on, Unit 2-4. Running that name through our system now. Stand by." David watched Carter in the rearview mirror. He could see the officer's smirk start to fade, replaced by a subtle frown. The silence stretched on, the tension in the car growing with each passing second. Then, the radio came to life again. "Unit 2-4, are you sure about that name?" Carter's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his fingers tapping nervously. "Yeah, I'm sure. David Smith. Why?" There was another pause, and David could see Carter's confidence wavering. "Unit 2-4, we've got a flag on that name. David Smith is a federal agent, CIA. Repeat, you've got a CIA agent in custody." The words hung in the air like a sudden drop in temperature. David watched as Carter's face went pale, his smirk vanishing entirely. For the first time since the encounter began, Carter seemed unsure of himself. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "Say again?" Carter finally managed to say, his voice quieter now, strained. "CIA?" The dispatcher's voice returned, firmer this time. "Affirmative. Unit 2-4. Smith is with the CIA. You need to release him immediately. We'll handle the rest from here." Carter's eyes widened, his expression now filled with a mix of confusion and fear. David met his gaze, his face calm, his eyes steady. He didn't need to say anything. The truth was already unfolding. The patrol car was quiet for a moment, the weight of the realization crashing down on Carter. David could see the gears turning in the officer's mind, trying to figure out what to do next. The arrogance, the swagger, all of it drained away in an instant, leaving Carter with nothing but the reality of the situation he had just created. I didn't know," Carter stammered, his voice shaky. "I didn't know he was—" But David cut him off, his voice cold and firm. "You didn't care to know." Carter swallowed hard, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and panic. He fumbled with the radio, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke again. "Dispatch, Unit 2-4 here. I'll release the suspect. Copy that." "Copy," came the dispatcher's reply, now curt and professional. "Make sure it's done right away." Carter dropped the radio back onto the console, sitting there for a moment in stunned silence. David could hear his breathing, rapid, uneven. The officer turned in his seat to face David, the smirk long gone, replaced by a hollow look of regret. His confidence had shattered. "Look," Carter began, his voice low, almost pleading. "I didn't know. I mean, you didn't say anything specific. If I had known—" David cut him off again, this time his voice calm but filled with weight. "I told you, you didn't listen." Carter's face reddened, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the door handle. He stepped out of the car, quickly walking around to the back and opening the door. David shifted slightly, watching as Carter hesitated, his hands hovering over the cuffs. For a moment, Carter didn't move. His eyes darted from David's face to the cuffs around his wrists, as if unsure of how to proceed, unsure of how to salvage the situation. Then slowly, Carter fumbled with the keys and unlocked the handcuffs, freeing David from the restraints. The metal fell away with a dull clink, but the weight of the moment remained. Carter stepped back, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to say something. An apology, an explanation, anything to make it better. But there was nothing he could say that would fix this. David simply stared at him, his expression blank, but the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. Carter stammered, I'm sorry, David didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was clear, and the silence between them said more than words ever could. He straightened his jacket, flexing his wrists as the circulation returned, and stepped out of the patrol car. Without another word, David walked away, leaving Carter standing there, speechless and broken. The silence between David and Officer Carter was thick and heavy, like a fog neither of them could escape. As David walked away from the patrol car, his back straight, his steps measured, Carter stood rooted in place, still holding the keys to the cuffs that had just been around David's wrists. The officer's face was pale, his breathing uneven. His mind was racing, trying to grasp what had just happened, and more importantly, what was about to happen next. David didn't bother looking back. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what was coming for Carter. As he walked toward his car, the quiet suburban street suddenly felt even quieter, as if the entire neighborhood had fallen under the weight of the officer's mistake. Carter finally snapped out of his daze, rushing back to his patrol car. He fumbled with the radio, his hands still shaking. "Dispatch," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "This is Unit 2-4. I've released the suspect, David Smith. He's free." There was a brief pause on the other end before the dispatcher responded, her tone clipped and professional. "Copy that, Unit 2-4. Stand by for further instructions." Carter stared at the radio, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what further instructions meant. He knew this wasn't something that would blow over with a simple apology. As he waited, his mind replayed everything that had just happened. The moment he saw David sitting in that car, the assumptions he made, the way he ignored every warning sign because of the man's skin color, because he had convinced himself that he was doing the right thing. But now, standing there, reality was sinking in. The radio crackled again. "Unit 2-4, report back to the station immediately. Supervisor wants to speak with you." Over. Carter swallowed hard. His mouth felt dry, and his hands, once confident, now trembled uncontrollably. "Copy that," he managed to say, his voice barely audible. He glanced back at David, who was now standing beside his car, adjusting his jacket as if nothing had happened. Carter's stomach churned. The power he had felt just minutes ago had evaporated, leaving him with nothing but dread. He climbed into his patrol car and sat there for a moment, staring blankly at the dashboard. He could feel his career slipping through his fingers. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, it was all teetering on the edge. He knew the consequences of his actions were inevitable, and they were about to hit him hard. As he started the car and pulled away from the curb, he couldn't shake the image of David's calm, steady face from his mind. He had been wrong, so wrong, and now he had to face the music. When Carter arrived back at the station, the atmosphere felt different, colder. His fellow officers didn't greet him with the usual nods or casual waves. There was a stiffness in the air, a tension that told him they knew. He hadn't even stepped inside, and already the whispers were circulating. He walked through the station doors, his steps heavier than before, his head down. As he passed by the front desk, he caught the glance of the receptionist, who quickly looked away. Word traveled fast, too fast. "Carter!" The sharp voice of his supervisor, Captain Hill, cut through the air like a blade. Carter flinched, his heart racing as he turned to see the captain standing at the entrance to his office, arms crossed, his face a mask of stern disappointment. "Get in here, now!" Carter's legs felt weak as he walked toward the office, feeling the eyes of his colleagues on him. The walls felt like they were closing in, the fluorescent lights above harsh and unforgiving. This was the moment he had been dreading since he left the scene. There was no escaping it now. He stepped into Captain Hill's office, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The room was sparse, the only decorations being framed certificates and awards lining the walls. But none of that made Carter feel any sense of comfort. The captain sat down behind his desk, staring at Carter with a look that made it clear this was no routine conversation. "Sit down," Hill ordered, his voice low but firm. Carter obeyed, lowering himself into the chair across from the desk. He could feel the sweat forming on his palms, the tension making it hard to breathe. Hill didn't speak for a moment, just stared at Carter as if trying to decide where to begin. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Tell me what happened out there," Hill said, his voice cold. Carter swallowed, trying to gather his thoughts. "It was a misunderstanding," he stammered. "I didn't know he was with the CIA. I didn't know—" "That's not what I asked," Hill interrupted, his voice sharp. "I asked what happened. From the moment you stopped that car to the moment you cuffed a federal agent on duty. Explain yourself." Carter's throat went dry. He could feel the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. Each word he tried to form caught in his throat. "I saw him sitting in the car," he began, his voice shaking. I thought he was suspicious. He didn't have plates, and he didn't look like he belonged there." Hill's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "He didn't look like he belonged. That's your reason?" Carter flinched at the question, knowing how it sounded, knowing how wrong it was. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't know." "You didn't know," Hill repeated, his voice growing louder. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to listen. A man told you he was on a federal operation, showed you his credentials, and you ignored him. You cuffed him, threw him in the back of your car, and now this department is going to have to deal with the fallout from your mistake." Carter's face flushed with shame. He had no defense. He knew that now. Hill leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "This department can't afford officers who act on assumptions. Do you realize how much damage you've caused? The CIA is breathing down our necks because of this. You put an entire operation at risk because you didn't stop and think." "I'm sorry," Carter whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to go this way." Hill's expression softened slightly, but the disappointment remained. "Sorry's not going to cut it. You've crossed a line, Carter. You crossed a line that we can't walk back." Carter felt his heart sink. He knew what was coming next. "You're suspended, effective immediately," Hill said, his voice cold and final. "Turn in your badge and your weapon. You'll be lucky if suspension is all you get." Carter's mouth went dry, his eyes wide with shock. "Suspended? You're lucky you're not fired on the spot," Hill said. "But we'll let the review board decide that. Now turn in your badge and get out of here." Carter's hands trembled as he reached for his badge, unhooking it from his belt. His fingers shook as he placed it on the desk, the metallic clink echoing through the room. As he stood up to leave, Carter felt a hollow emptiness settle in his chest. He had gone from being in control, the one giving orders, to being stripped of everything he thought made him who he was. He had no one to blame but himself. As he walked out of the station, head down, he could feel the eyes on him. The weight of their judgment, their silent condemnation, followed him with every step. This was the consequence of his actions, and there was no escaping it now. Carter stood outside the station, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud, leaving him on the sidewalk staring blankly at the street. His badge was gone. He felt stripped, exposed, as if the uniform he still wore no longer belonged to him. The weight of the day's events pressed down on his shoulders like a vice, squeezing tighter with each breath. He looked around, hoping to see something familiar, something to ground him, but all he could feel was the slow realization of how much he had lost. His hands shook at his sides. A chill ran down his spine, even though the day was warm. People walked past him, going about their day, unaware of the internal storm ripping through him. Carter took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had never felt this kind of helplessness before. It was always him in control, him giving the orders, making the calls. But now he had nothing. He had let his assumptions, his arrogance, and his inability to see past his own biases strip everything away. He walked slowly toward his car, parked in the station lot, his legs feeling weak beneath him. The usual authority he carried was gone, replaced by a dull, hollow ache. As he reached the car, he paused, his hand resting on the driver's side door handle. For a moment, he stood there, staring at his reflection in the window, his face pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. He hardly recognized himself. The radio call, the dispatcher's voice revealing David Smith's identity, still echoed in his mind. CIA agent. He had arrested a federal agent on duty. The weight of it was too much to bear. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. And for what? A suspicion? A feeling that David didn't belong in that neighborhood? The truth had hit him harder than any blow ever could. Carter finally opened the door and sank into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His mind was racing, trying to find something, anything that would explain what he had done, but there was nothing. No justification, no excuse. He had let his own prejudice dictate his actions, and now it had cost him everything. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He couldn't bear to face the calls or texts from his colleagues, from his family. What could he even say to them? That he had ruined his career in a matter of minutes? That he had allowed his arrogance and biases to strip him of everything he had worked for? With trembling hands, he reached into the glove compartment, pulling out his police-issued notepad. The pages were filled with names, dates, and notes on arrests he had made over the years. At one point, he had been proud of this, his record of service, his proof that he was a good cop, someone who kept the community safe. But now, as he flipped through the pages, all he could see was how blind he had been. The faces of the people he had stopped, questioned, and arrested over the years blurred together in his mind. How many of them had felt the same way David did that day? How many times had Carter assumed guilt based on nothing more than a gut feeling, a sense that someone didn't belong? He had always told himself he was doing his job, but now, in the aftermath, it felt hollow, empty. Carter closed the notebook, tossing it onto the passenger seat. His phone buzzed again, but this time he pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from his wife. He stared at it for a moment, feeling a fresh wave of shame wash over him. What was he going to tell her? That he was suspended? That he was likely going to be fired? That the man she thought was a hero was now a public embarrassment? His fingers hovered over the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to reply. He placed the phone back in his pocket and leaned his head against the steering wheel, closing his eyes. The weight of the day was crushing him, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense. Word had spread quickly about what had happened. Officers whispered among themselves, some casting glances toward the door, waiting for the next development. No one said it aloud, but the message was clear. Carter was done. His career, once so promising, had ended in disgrace. In the captain's office, Hill sat behind his desk, a stack of papers in front of him. He was no stranger to handling disciplinary actions, but this one was different. The fallout from Carter's actions wouldn't just affect the department, it would ripple through the community, through the public perception of the police force as a whole. Racial profiling, abuse of power, mishandling a federal agent, these were things that would leave a permanent stain on the department's reputation. Hill sighed, rubbing his temples as he reviewed the incident report. It was clear from the beginning that Carter had acted on his biases, not facts. He had failed to listen, failed to ask the right questions. Instead, he had let his assumptions drive him straight into disaster. The phone on Hill's desk rang and he picked it up. "Hill," he said, his voice tired. "Captain, it's about Carter," came the voice on the other end. "The review board wants to meet. They're pushing for immediate termination." Hill nodded, though the caller couldn't see him. "I figured as much. Make sure the paperwork's ready. This has to be handled cleanly." As he hung up the phone, Hill leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. He had seen good officers fall before, but this one stung more. Carter had been one of the promising ones, but in the end, his pride and his prejudice had brought him down. Hours later, Carter still sat in his car, his mind numb, when he received the final call. His phone buzzed again, and this time he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Carter," he said, knowing who it was before he even heard the voice on the other end. "Officer Carter!" Hill's voice came through, firm but not angry. "It's over. The review board has made their decision. You're officially terminated from the force, effective immediately." Carter closed his eyes, the words hitting him like a blow to the chest. He had known this was coming, but hearing it aloud made it real. "I understand," Carter replied, his voice flat, emotionless. "I need you to come back in and finalize the paperwork," Hill continued. "After that, you're free to go." Carter nodded, even though Hill couldn't see him. "I'll be there." As he hung up the phone, Carter sat in silence for a long moment, staring out the windshield. His career was over, but more than that, his sense of self was shattered. Everything he thought he knew about his job, about what it meant to be a good cop, had been ripped away in an instant. He started the car, the engine humming to life, and pulled out of the lot. The station faded into the distance behind him, and as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just his job he had lost. It was his sense of who he was. David Smith stood next to his car. For a moment, David allowed himself to breathe deeply, feeling the tension leave his body. It had been a long, exhausting day, and though the immediate danger was over, the weight of the encounter still pressed down on him. He adjusted his jacket, feeling the lingering ache in his wrists from the handcuffs. The sting wasn't just physical, it was a reminder of how easily things could go wrong. Even now, after all these years, after everything he had achieved, moments like this brought back the same old truth. Some people would never see beyond the surface. David closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. He couldn't let this derail him, not now. He still had a job to do. He glanced down the street toward the house he had been watching all afternoon, the house that was still his priority. The operation had nearly been compromised because of Carter's actions, but it wasn't over. David couldn't afford to lose focus, not when so much was at stake. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the quiet. David pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from his superior, a simple check-in. "Everything clear on your end?" David stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "All clear now. Back on task." It was the truth. Despite the chaos of the day, the mission was still intact. But there was more behind those words, something deeper. David had come out of this encounter unscathed physically, but emotionally, it was another reminder of the battle he had been fighting his entire life. He put the phone away and turned his attention back to the house. There was still work to be done, and he couldn't let Carter's actions distract him from the larger picture. He slid back into his car, the seat feeling familiar under him, the surveillance gears still humming softly. The house across the street remained quiet, the suspect inside unaware of the near disaster that had unfolded only moments ago. David took another deep breath and focused. He had a job to finish. As he settled in, his mind wandered back to the events of the day, replaying the confrontation with Carter in his head, the suspicion in the officer's voice, the tension that had grown with each passing moment, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his skin. It wasn't the first time David had been in that position, and he knew it likely wouldn't be the last. Despite his position, despite his years of service, he had been reduced to nothing more than a suspicious figure in the wrong place at the wrong time. David wasn't angry, not anymore. He had learned long ago how to process that kind of injustice, how to let it settle without letting it consume him. Anger wouldn't serve him, not in the field, but the disappointment, that lingered. The disappointment in people like Carter, in the system that had created him, and in the countless others who made assumptions without ever stopping to listen. He had seen it too many times. Officers who acted first and asked questions later, convinced they were doing the right thing. Carter had been one of them. He had believed he was in control, that his authority was enough to justify his actions. But David had known from the start that it would unravel. It always did. Still, as he watched the house, David couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had shifted. Carter was gone, but the impact of what had happened wouldn't disappear so easily. It never did. The system would keep turning, and officers like Carter would come and go, each carrying their own biases, their own assumptions. And David would continue doing his job, navigating a world where his skin color made him a target just as much as his skill set. It made him an asset. He adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of himself, his face calm but tired. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood. It was peaceful here, the kind of peace that people like Carter believed they were protecting. But peace built on ignorance wasn't peace at all. It was just a fragile illusion, waiting to be shattered by a single moment of truth. David's phone buzzed again, this time with an update on the operation. He scanned the message quickly, noting the details. The suspect was still inside, no movement yet. Good, that meant there was still time. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes locked on the house and settled into the familiar rhythm of surveillance. His mind was clear now, focused on the task at hand. The operation came first, always. But as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't help but think of Carter again, of how different things could have been if the officer had just listened. In the end, Carter had lost everything because he couldn't see beyond his own biases. David had seen it in his eyes. The moment the truth hit him, the realization that he had made a mistake he couldn't take back. But it wasn't David's job to teach him that lesson. It wasn't his responsibility to fix a broken system. His only job was to finish what he had started, to protect, to serve, to do his part. He glanced at the house one more time, making sure everything was still in place before leaning back in his seat. The evening air was cooler now, the neighborhood slipping into a quiet calm. David stayed vigilant, his body relaxed but his mind sharp. There would always be people like Carter, and there would always be moments like the one they had shared. But David wasn't here to dwell on that. He was here to do his job, and nothing, not even a bad cop with a chip on his shoulder, would stop him from doing what needed to be done. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the street in shadows, David allowed himself a small, quiet breath. The mission wasn't over, but he had weathered the storm. He was still here, still standing, still ready for whatever came next. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.